Next slide. This shows you the auditory pathways. So notice here we have two structures in the hindbrain called the olivary complex. Specific neurons in the olivary complex respond to differences in the time of arrival of the two ears or differences in loudness at the two ears. That is, these are your location sensors. If a particular neuron in the olivary is active, it means the sound arrived with a particular temporal delay and intensity difference, telling you where the sound came from. The inferior colliculus is where sight and sound are integrated. It's part of that superior-inferior colliculus collaboration. You can see it's also responsible for some pitch processing and something with additional processing for localization. Vision comes into the thalamus at the lateral geniculate nucleus, and sound comes into the thalamus at the medial geniculate nucleus. Next slide. All right, so does hearing use progressive elaboration? Remember, in vision we talked about spots becoming lines, which became shapes, which became complex shapes, which became your grandmother's face. So do simple pitch signals become more complex sounds? Does complex sounds become language? Does language become whatever's higher than language? So does hearing use progressive elaboration? Well, to make sense, next slide, to make sense of that, we would need to consider what are the basic elements of sound. And here we're taking in one step up from pitch and loudness. We're talking about the critical perceptual components of sound. So a phoneme, which is it's a sound that cannot be reduced any farther. It is a unique sound perceived in a special way. Those of us who speak English have a set of phonemes that are unique to English. Someone who speaks perhaps Russian may have a different set of phonemes. So these phonemes are not entirely inherited, they are often developed. But the basic features, pitch, loudness, end up getting detected and elaborated into phonemes. Now, what do we know about phoneme processing? That is, do we have phoneme detectors? Do we have an ah detector, ba detector, s detector, and so forth? If I repeatedly present a single phoneme, ah, 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 I just keep repeating that phoneme, ah, 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 the minimum loudness for that phoneme at which you will hear it gets higher and higher. That is, your sensitivity is reduced if the phoneme is presented repeatedly. What that would suggest is that we have phoneme detectors, and that if I repeatedly stimulate that phoneme detector, as I would if I just kept saying ah, 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 then it becomes fatigued. If it's fatigued, it takes more intensity for it to respond. Thus, the effect of repeated presentation of a particular phoneme supports the existence of phoneme detectors. Next slide. If we go up a level, instead of looking for a fatigue effect, if we just look for, using functional imaging, look for activity. So here, the participants were presented with speech sounds. So they were not clear phonemes, they were, as it says here in the slide, ambiguous speech sounds. The activity in the brain would correspond to where's the activity as the person processes the sound into a perceived phoneme. And the bottom line, you can see that activity is right around A1. It's not exactly A1, it's just a little below and behind Heschel's gyrus. So there are definitely areas of